and friends just the importance of reliable internet connectivity, and ensuring that all parts of the country have reliable access to broadband services is critical. Without access to these services, we wouldn't have students continuing their education through distance learning. Many parts of the country's workforce wouldn't be able to telework, and we wouldn't be able to provide essential telehealth services to many individuals. Throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, I've been encouraged by the performance of both mobile and fixed broadband networks in the United States. Carriers, by and large, are meeting consumers' demands, and even with the unprecedented amount of traffic on our communications networks, they have stepped up to keep our country connected, so we thank you for that. This is much different from what we are seeing in other parts of the world. Take, for example, Europe, which has pursued a more heavy-handed regulatory approach to broadband services. This has resulted in far less investment in communications network expansion, and now today we are seeing their networks struggle to keep up with the increased demands. Because of the light touch approach to broadband regulation by the federal government of the United States, we've seen access to these critical services expand significantly, including to some of the most rural areas of the country. And if we want the Internet to continue to thrive and serve as an engine for economic innovation and advancement, we should ensure that our policies continue to encourage more investment by the private sector in our communications networks. Mr. Spalter, could you just talk about what impact the current U.S. broadband regulatory climate has had on broadband investment, especially in rural areas, and would you expect the same level of investment in the broadband sector was more heavily regulated?
I think that the extraordinary performance that we're seeing in our networks today and the ability to have expanded broadband access, albeit still work to be done, is a direct result and is no accident to the exactly that light touch, flexible, forward-looking, and I must stress this, bipartisan approach that has been the hallmark of American innovation policy for fully a generation. The reason that American broadband companies can invest upwards of $70 billion annually in our nation's infrastructure to bring broadband, best in the world broadband, to our citizens is directly related to that policy framework. If we want to continue the runway for this kind of progress as we transit to new generations of service and to fundamentally do the important work of closing the digital divide once and for all, that framework is a critical input, and without it, we are going to regress, not progress.
Mr. Berry, you referenced that in your testimony as well. Could you expand on those regulatory burdens and how they will continue to affect carriers once the pandemic is over, especially as we think about transitioning to 5G technologies?
Thank you, Senator. Your streamlined cell siting act is something we very much support. We appreciate the effort. You and Senator Schatz have been stellar in your effort on that. I think that is going to help us advance 5G, not only 4G, LTE, VoLTE, and 5G as we move forward. We're seeing a lot of pent-up need for licensing and permitting because, you know, the local county, state governments that are approved the permits are sheltering in place also. So I think we're going to see an opportunity right after the COVID-19 pandemic crisis to have a new initiative in building out rural broadband, especially in the rural areas where you need to approve sites, and especially on federal land. So thank you for that legislative initiative.
Thank you. Ms. Bloomfield, it's clear that this pandemic has highlighted the importance of reliable broadband services, and I know you've spoken, I think, to this already, but what steps should Congress take to ensure that truly unserved areas are getting access to these services?
Well, thank you very much, Senator. I think you've also taken a huge step by initiating some mapping initiatives. So again, we can kind of do it right, do it smart. As we've talked about with this panel today, broadband deployment is not a cheap proposition, but we know how critical it is, and I think we've seen over the past 2 months that it's more critical than we even knew. So the key is to do it right. The key is to make the best use of those resources, to take programs that you've got, like the upcoming RDOF auction at the FCC, to take the Reconnect support from USDA. How do you marry those programs together? And then how do you also interject potentially what state initiatives might be so that you are getting the best bang for your buck, you are reaching the most Americans, and you are making sure that we're not doing this again in another 5-10 years?
And very quickly, as a follow-up to that, to Mr. Berry, because we did pass, and Ms. Bloomfield referenced the Broadband Data Act, which is legislation aimed at improving the mapping process at the FCC. How important is it that we get the data right as we deploy new broadband networks?
I think it's absolutely critical, Senator. I said If you go back a decade when we did the first broadband map, and then the stimulus programs thereafter, it was a shot in the dark. We spent billions of dollars not knowing where the money should actually go. We have an opportunity a decade later through the legislation that this committee passed to get it right. And I think the old saying, measure twice, cut once. Well, I think if you only have $9 billion over 10 years for a mobile product and you have about 3 times that on a wireline product, you've got to get it right the first time. And I would hate to think that we're going to overlook those areas that could and should and very well need to be connected because we don't know where they are. It just boggles my mind that we can't actually focus our resources in the areas that are most need.
Thank you.
I
Thanks,
hope
Mr. Chairman.
everyone is listening there.